Hey all, this is Paul Carter, and this is my Module 8 case study for Get This Child Out of My Room. First category is problem identification and analysis. So, what do I know? First off, I wanted to address the people that are involved. Carl, who's the student with the behavior disorder. Nancy Taylor, who is his third grade classroom teacher. Susan Green is in her first year as a special education teacher. Mr. and Mrs. Hughes are Carl's parents. Mr. Hughes really doesn't want anything to do with the situation, and Mrs. Hughes has a couple issues there that we'll mention here in a second. Mrs. Lewis was the previous SPED teacher that is mentioned in the case. Mrs. Williams is, or Mrs. Willis is the district coordinator for special education, and then the superintendent as well as the assistant superintendent who are unnamed. So what do I know? Carl's behavior has changed. This happened because of his parents' divorce. This went from self-abuse and to where he had aggression towards his teacher as well as other teachers when it mentioned that he was throwing rocks from the bus. Resources are minimal. It's a small rural school district. They share resources with other districts around them. So there's not a lot available. But there is a resource room available. But the SPED teacher, Mrs. Green, does not think Carl should be placed there all day. She doesn't agree that this is as students are supposed to be in the LRE, the least restricted environment. She feels like he shouldn't be there and he should be okay in the general education classroom. Nancy, the third grade teacher, has given up. She's quoted as saying, talking and planning is not going to do any good. She doesn't think that the situation could be fixed. She just wants Carl out of her room. The Hughes relation is very strained as they as a husband and wife, they are divorced and they do not agree on a lot of things, and they are very angry with each other, as we saw during the SPED meeting when Mrs. Hughes lashed out at Mr. Hughes. Mrs. Taylor is starting to resent Mrs. Green at the end. After the meeting, she even flat out told her that I wish you did things like the last SPED teacher. So what do I need to know in this situation? First is, has Mrs. Taylor had any issues with students with behavior disorders before? Or is this the first instance? Because I need to know, is this just a weakness that she has as a teacher? Or is she just not good at dealing with behaviors? Of that I'm not sure. What counseling services are available in my district? Carl could definitely benefit from emotional and then even behavior support. Then what support, if any, is the family utilizing outside of the school? Are they already trying to get Carl counseling outside of school, or are they just expecting the school to take care of it? What other staff members or members are familiar with Carl, potentially bringing them in as part of our team to help solve the issues? And then is Mrs. Taylor even willing to try something new? It sounds like, from what I'm reading in between the lines, it doesn't sound like she's willing. She's given up. But hopefully she has not given up and she is willing. So the problem identification. Number one, Carl is not being successful in Mrs. Taylor's classroom. That is a very obvious problem. Carl's aggressive behaviors are starting to endanger others, not only the teachers, but even moving to the students that are in the classroom or around him. And lastly, Mrs. Taylor and Mrs. Green have conflicting opinions on how Carl's behavior should be handled. Mrs. Taylor wants him out of the room. Mrs. Green wants him in the room as much as she possibly can, using a behavior plan. So category 2, proposed plan of action with the appropriate strategies for implementation. So step 1 is talk to Carl. In this whole case study, it seems like they have not really talked to him much. Mrs. Green has not sat down with Carl, to my knowledge, and talked with him, find out what is he thinking, what other issues besides the divorce might be going on. What does he think would make the situation better? Maybe he has some ideas. And then what are his interests? Those can be given to Mrs. Taylor, and maybe she can make a connection with him, because it doesn't seem like she has tried to do that. Step 2 is explore what other resources are available to use. We wouldn't want to pull Carl all day from the general education classroom. We want him in the general education classroom if at all possible, as well as, is there any social workers or counselors available for us to use? And then partnering with community members that are involved in Carl's interest. If we can get him involved with upstanding citizens that would be willing to kind of mentor him, I think would be very helpful. Step 3 is meeting with Mrs. Green, Mrs. Taylor, and Carl, and then letting everybody know what concerns they have. But it need to be a very structured meeting so that there weren't any strong strong attitudes towards anybody. Step 4, involve other teachers who work with Carl. This could be PE, art, past teachers. Find out if they are having issues or is this just because of Mrs. Taylor. This will help create a more well-rounded view of Carl's behavior. Right now we're getting the opinion of Mrs. Taylor in the classroom, so we need to see, is he acting out anywhere else. Step 5 is set up a meeting with Mrs. Green, Mrs. Taylor, other involved teachers, Mrs. Willis, assistant superintendent, and the superintendent, and get everybody on the same page. We've been hearing a lot of conflicting reports around, so getting everybody on the same page and creating this special team that is there to review and change or edit any existing behavior plan or create a brand new one. Step 6, present the new behavior plan to the Hughes. We got to get the parent permission, call them in for another meeting, and show them. It sounds like they would approve it. They're willing to do about whatever to help Carl, or they're a little bit more hands off, especially Mr. Hughes. But I would also send Mrs. Taylor to training, either sensitivity training or behavior management training. She needs to learn how to work with students with behavior disorders because it seems pretty obvious that she does not know how to handle this. Step 8 is we would implement whatever that behavior plan that our team created, as well as Mrs. Willis have her go in and watch Miss Taylor in the classroom, make sure what she is doing is correct, as well as I'd send Mrs. Green so she's also on the same page there in the classroom. And then step 9, and after we collect the data from our observations, then we can review/modify the behavior plan as needed and find out, is it really effective for Carl, Mrs. Taylor, and all the other students in the room. Category 3 is resolve issues based on promoting the success of all students. So, was it best for students? Yes, because Carl is not losing general education classroom time. We're trying to keep him in the classroom. Carl is receiving the emotional support he needs, whether that's through our social worker, counselor, or outside sources. Other student safety in Carl's class is the top priority. We're worried about him potentially harming somebody, so we keep that in mind. Other students' learning environment will improve as Carl's behaviors decrease. There won't be nearly as many disruptions in Mrs. Taylor's classroom. Category 4 is what was I thinking, feeling, and valuing? Well, I was thinking that the situation could easily get worse if we just let it go and we don't address it. We must find the best possible solution for everyone involved, not only Carl, but also Mrs. Taylor and the other students specifically in that classroom. And then where to find the resource if they're not already available. If we don't have the resources in our district, what are we going to do? I was feeling sad for Carl. He's put in a situation with his parents' nasty divorce that we don't want to put students in, so I was feeling bad for him. Frustrated at the Hughes for the situation they put Carl in. I was frustrated at the way they handled themselves in the IEP meeting. It was extremely unprofessional and not the place for that, and obviously they're putting Carl in a very bad position, so I was very frustrated with them. I'm also frustrated at Mrs. Taylor because it sounds like she's just very unwilling to try something new, and that's what teachers are here for, and she is not doing her job. I was valuing Carl's emotional health as well as Carl's education, leaving him in that classroom as much as it can. But we got to really worry about Carl's emotional health because it's obviously not in a good place at the moment. I'm also valuing other students' education as well as democratic participative leadership theory, which is what I personally use and believe in, by creating that special team with people involved that was in my action plan. So, unresolved issues, Mrs. Taylor's ability to work with difficult students. Will she be able to put her frustrations aside to be able to help to learn and then be able to help Carl? Will the action plan work for Carl? That's obvious, but that last step was reviewing it and making any changes as needed. Are there any additional resources available that could benefit Carl? What else could we use? Will the Hughes relationship worsen and therefore Carl's behavior? Is his behavior directly linked with his parents' behavior towards each other? And then lastly, will the training given to Mrs. Taylor be effective? Will she be able to become that teacher that Carl obviously needs in his life? So, category 5. Component 1 is promoted the academic success. How did I do that? I kept Carl in the least restrictive environment by keeping him in the general education classroom. Focused not only on Carl's success, but the other students in the room. We can't forget the other potentially 30 other students in that classroom. Gave training to Mrs. Taylor so she could improve as a teacher, which would help all students. Created a democratic, participative team to help solve the issues. Didn't just make the decisions alone, involved others that were directly involved. And then limited Carl's disruptive behaviors, which would cause a better learning environment and a safer one at that. Component 2, and is how I promoted the well-being of students. Other student safety was always kept in mind. It's going to be written in the behavior plan and how safe they are. Carl received emotional and behavior support through counseling or other outsourced resources, and even potentially mentoring with the community. And then showed Carl respect by involving him in the conversation. We didn't just make this for him and then apply it to him. We involved him as part of the team for himself. Component 3, and that is an enhanced instructional capacity, especially Mrs. Taylor, because we gave Mrs. Taylor training in behavior management. She's lacking in this, so we were able to send her to training to get her the help she needs. Mrs. Taylor will be a more effective teacher to all students, not just Carl, and future students as well. And then Mrs. Green, the first year special education teacher, she gained a ton of experience getting this kind of nasty of a situation right at the very beginning of her tenure as a teacher. She has this learning experience to be able to help her in the future. Overall, I found this case to be very interesting, and I have seen this almost exact case in my school over the past couple of years, and so it was very interesting to see it in the eyes of an administrator.